Hello, everyone, and welcome in. The off season is here, and that means the return of the Mad Science Lab podcast. I am Aaron St. Denis. You can find me on Twitter at FFMadScientist. Today, I am joined by Jack Lucenay at Jack Lucenay. Easy enough to remember. How is it going, Jack? What are you up to, man? How's it going?
Oh, I'm surviving. My ears are still plugged. I'm still sweating this fever a little bit, but hey, Michael Jordan flu game. We're pushing through. I've got a lot of shit going on right now. A lot of stuff going on right now. I'm so used to my own show. I'll try and keep it a little cleaner for you guys here. But I've got right now the worst fantasy show dropping every Monday morning at 8 a.m., the worst wrestling podcast every Saturday at 4:20 p.m., and Wildcard Wednesdays. That's the comedy interview series. Aaron's been on there before, dropping every Wednesday mornings at 8 a.m. On my YouTube. And you can find the audio versions on Spotify. And, of course, you can find the shorts on TikTok.
Well, it's great to have you, Jack. Like I said, you get to kick things off here, getting started with the Mad Science Lab podcast in the off season. We are going to do the same thing I did last year. Every day, a different guest, and every month, a different series. We are going to start with 2024 Dynasty Fantasy Football Risers and Fallers. Like I said, this one is going to be a collaboration between my company, the Fantasy Football Universe, and our new home, Fantasy Football Advice Network. So if you want to check out either of those, go to fantasyfootballuniverse.com or fantasyfootballadvicenetwork.com. That's a lot of fantasy footballs in two names. Anyways, this is the Mad Science Lab podcast on the Fantasy Football Advice Network in conjunction with the Fantasy Football Universe. Nice little exclusive graphic provided to me by Tyler. Got to work on my transitions here. I'm going to start using the FFU, FFAN because I don't want to say that much on every show. But let's get into it here. I guess we've got your first. We're going to start with your riser. That is Nico Collins. I'll run through some of his stats here. Last year was his third season after graduating from Michigan. First time he really did anything. He finished as wide receiver 86 in 2021, 77 in 2022. Last year, he finished as wide receiver 12. He had 80 receptions on 109 targets, 1,297 yards, and 8 touchdowns. He currently sits as 44 overall on KTC, which is Keep Trade Cut, 31st overall on Fantasy Pros. I'm going to look him up quickly. We just said this. He is wide receiver 16 on Keep Trade Cut. And what did we say he was? Wide receiver 17 on Fantasy Pros. So he is a consensus wide receiver 2, I guess. I know he's a riser for you, but you plan on selling him? Tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm working a little bit backwards on your show, of course, because that's just the way I am. But I always also say that you got to lean on people smarter than yourself. So I'm going to give you the good before I give you the bad. The good is coming straight from two of the smartest minds, I would say, in fantasy football, aside from yourself, Aaron. The first I'm going to rip off is Nick Pentakoff. He basically put out an awesome tweet that was just laying out the splits for Nico Collins with and without Tank Dell, because I think obviously the first concern everyone's going to have is when Tank Dell comes back, how much is that going to eat into the production of a Nico Collins? So you have the 9 games with 7.4 targets, 5.1 receptions, 80 receiving yards, 0.6 touchdowns, 16.4 fantasy points per game on average, right?
Yep.
Without, for the 8 games, 7.4 targets, 5.6 receptions, 92.6 receiving yards, 0.5 touchdowns, and about 18 fantasy points per game. So slight uptick, but actually pretty much similar numbers there. So the fact that Tank Dell would be returning to this offense, I don't actually think that affects Nico Collins in terms of just like negating the stats that he's going to put up. Now, the other part is, can he ascend higher than what he's already done? That part I'm still struggling with. However, I will say that, again, Matt Harmon, who I think is considered the wide receiver guru among fantasy analysts, On Reception Perception, also shout out to James Coe, the co-host. They were discussing Nico Collins and basically said that, yeah, maybe he is ready to enter the superstar club. Mentioned specifically that he checks all the boxes: yards per route run against man coverage after the catch. He had a 73.4% catch rate, which was crazy because of the amount of downfield throws that he had. So, that 1,300 yards and 8 touchdowns we talked about with CJ Stroud ascending, maybe there is still room for growth. However, this is where the bad comes in. The draft capital is already out of control. Now, granted, it was best ball, and I was doing the little big board on Underdog. Shout out to Underdog Fantasy. I saw him go off the board at 2-2. So, when you get into redraft season, by the time we get there, with all the hype that's going to come in by the time we get there, if he's going off the board anywhere between 2-2 and 2-6 in a 12-man redraft, you can count me way out. In a startup dynasty, if he's going up anywhere in that range, you can also count me out. Because of that, I would consider selling him right now. If you're in a dynasty that's ongoing and you have Nico Collins, I think this is a great opportunity to package and sell to get to an even more elite wide receiver. The one I was going to bring up was AJ Brown. I think after the season, he just had people feel down on AJ Brown. I think you could package Nico Collins and maybe like a high second, late first pick to get to AJ Brown. They had the same stats. AJ Brown coming off a bad year, Nico Collins coming off a good one. So that's kind of the pivot I'm looking to make. I'd be fine keeping him, but there's no way I'm going to be drafting him at the capital that. And again, I know it's lower in some of the more savvier circles of fantasy. He's considered maybe more of like a wide receiver, 17, 18 in that range. But even then, like that's pretty intense for where he was last year compared to where he is this year. Last year, he was, last round sleeper to undrafted in many leagues versus now being considered almost like a second round pick. That's a little intense for me. It's a little rich for my blood.
Yeah, for me, that's exactly what it's going to be. It's going to come down to the cost. I don't mind him at, like I said, KTC and Fantasy Pros has him as either wide receiver 16 or 17. They've got him, KTC has him 44th overall. I don't mind him as a late 4th round pick. Fantasy Pros has him a little higher as 31. I don't know if I love him in the 3rd round. Wide receiver 17 in the 3rd round. I think that's a little too rich for my blood. For me, I don't want him any higher than a 4th. Like, I'm looking at some of the names here. So you've got your big guys ahead of him. I'm going by KTC right now. Jefferson, Lamb, Chase, St. Brown, blah, blah, blah. I'm not all those guys over him. Nakua, Wilson, AJ Brown, Olave. They've got the 2 in Marvin Harrison Jr. and Neighbors in there. I don't know. I would assume I'm taking them as well. I get the rookies, but I think it's still pretty easy. Hill easily. Ayuk, Waddle. Like, have I seen a name here where you would consider taking Nico over them? Ayuk, Waddle, Devonta Smith?
I mean, when you get to Waddle and Devonta Smith, that's an interesting conversation to have. Yeah. If you view Nico Collins as the wide receiver 1, you can make that argument, but I think a lot of people are still calling him the wide receiver 2. They view Tank Dell as more of a priority. I actually think I would disagree. Now, Jalen Waddle's, I don't know if I could pass on that. Devonta Smith, that's an interesting one. When we get down to arguing Devonta Smith versus Nico Collins,
yeah,
but I think at that point, the problem is when you look at some of the other positions on the board, like some of the running backs that have been going in that range, like in the draft I did again, he went ahead of Jonathan Taylor. I would much rather have Jonathan Taylor as a running back on my team than Nico Collins as a wide receiver because, the next guy that we'll talk about, I can get him much later, and I feel like they could put up the exact same stats.
I guess, like I said, it's depending on what site you're going and where the ADP. If he's going at the 202, I'm way out. But like Fantasy Pros, okay, so they've got him at 31. T. Higgins is after him. Drake London's after him. I like him more than London. I like him more than Pacheco. Andrews. Dell is below him. I might even take Tank Dell over him, especially in Dynasty. You get the extra years. Whereas, like I said, on keep trade cut, he's significantly lower. One sec, I'm trying to queue up where he is overall on keep trade cut. What did I say? Wide receiver 16. So he is in the range of Pittman, Achane, Rice, Fields, Kyron. Like, I don't know. I think I'd
Pittman
rather
and Achane, and right away I was like, I think I would rather have Michael Pittman and Devon Achane.
the only one that's in this range with him that I wouldn't rather have, I think I'd take him over Drake London. But aside from that, like maybe Rashi Rice, I think is close. But like I said, I think Tank Dell's going almost a full round after him, and I think I would take Tank Dell over him.
Even the Drake London argument is like, who let's see who the quarterback is by the time we get to offseason. The problem is I think Nico Collins' price is only going to go up because people are so high on CJ Stroud.
Yeah.
Where it's like some of these other guys are going to stagnate where they are. So I do think you're going to have to end up paying up for a Nico Collins because people are so high on CJ Stroud.
I just mean, like, I'm looking right now under the assumption of what the value is right now.
Yeah,
Drake they're 16, 17 right now. And at the same price, I'd take Nico over Drake. I had this debate on Twitter earlier with Dallas Goedert as my example, and I'm not doing this where we give a guy every year we're going to overdraft him because he has potential. Oh, he had a bad quarterback. Oh, he's got upside. We're going to overdraft him for 5 years and then be like, oh, he sucks. I'm just not doing it. So.
Well, see, that's the thing is like I think Drake London's much more talented than Dallas Goedert.
I don't think he sucks. If you give me the choice between him and Nico, I'll take Nico. He's my cutoff point right there. Even like you've got the running back. Travis Etienne is going, 11 picks later on keep trade cut. I'll take Etienne.
This is what I'm saying. Nico Collins' value right now is incredibly hard to judge, and it feels like every instance is too high. So it's like if I can pivot right now in like I said before, if I'm in a dynasty league and I have Nico Collins right now, I would be perfectly fine trade. You said Travis Etienne. If I'm a team that needs a running back, I would happily trade him for Etienne. I would happily trade him even for Drake. Maybe if the person is as down on Drake London as you, and they're going to give me the pick back, and I can get Drake London and maybe like a second, do like a pick swap. Drake London in a second for Nico in my third or something. You know what I'm saying? Like
I wouldn't go that far. Like if you want to give me straight up, I'll do it straight up. But yeah, I'm not down on Drake enough that I'd throw in a pick to get Nico. But
just like you said, I start the conversation with the pick swap. You say to me, you know what? I'll do it straight up, but forget the picks. Okay, let's do it straight up. Now I have Drake. Maybe I believe more long term in Drake London, who's younger, bigger, potentially more of a wide receiver one with a real coach and a real quarterback.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I'm at with Nico Collins. Is like I think he's a really valuable trade piece right now.
I think I want the guy attached to CJ Stroud for the immediate future. But all right, we're talking a long time on Nico. Let's head into your faller. That is Jacksonville wide receiver Calvin Ridley. So starting, he's gone through 6 seasons. In Atlanta, he was wide receiver 22, 27, and 5. And then obviously had an injury, sat out a season for gambling. First year in Jacksonville, last year finished as wide receiver 18, 76 receptions on 136 targets. That is a terrible completion percentage. Catch rate. I've never noticed that before. 1,016 yards, 8 touchdowns. He currently sits as 124 overall on keep trade cut, 88 overall on Fantasy Pros. Let's scroll down and see exactly where that has him in the wide receiver. What did I say on Fantasy Pros? 83, sorry. 83 has him as wide receiver 37 on Fantasy Pros, and keep trade cut. Oh, I've got to go to the next page. That's how low he's fallen. So the last year he was wide receiver 14 or 16. That's why I was out. This year he is wide receiver 48. So I am a well-known Calvin Ridley detractor, but at wide receiver 48 prices, if he does fall that low, I think I would be in. What are your thoughts on Calvin Ridley?
So I love that you've already kind of laid out some of my arguments for me. A lot of what I'm going to say for Calvin Ridley versus the stats with Nico Collins, this is a little bit more of conjecture. I think you either have to believe that Trevor Lawrence is a good quarterback or you're in the camp of he's washed. I think it's ridiculous to say that he's washed at, what is he, 23 or 24? Like,
no, he's older than that. He's 29.
Trevor Lawrence?
Oh, no, sorry. I thought you were talking Ridley. Sorry, no. My bad. Bad. We got our wires crossed. I
know. Trevor Lawrence is a young quarterback, is what I'm trying
Lawrence
to say.
is 24. My bad. Trevor Lawrence is 24.
So
I thought you were still talking
People
Ridley.
are acting like Trevor Lawrence is washed at 24 years old because he had a bad season. Like, it happens, guys. Like, he's in Jacksonville. They're still kind of working things out. And the biggest thing that I saw was still he had 4,000 yards, 21 touchdowns, and 14 interceptions. That's only 2 touchdowns less than CJ Stroud had, by the way, guys. CJ Stroud just had a lot less interceptions. That's why he looks so much better by contrast. But when you talk about Trevor Lawrence, I think the first thing that everyone remembers is the amount of almost touchdowns that he had last season. And several of those were Calvin Ridley's almost touchdowns. I think you're talking about Calvin Ridley coming off the first season away from football for 2 years. No matter how much you've been working out in your off season, football shape is a different shape. Football speed is a different speed when you're playing in the game.
You're right, though. Hey, I'm just looking at that now. CJ Stroud and Trevor Lawrence. Lawrence threw for 8 more yards, identical touchdowns. Stroud threw for 9 less interceptions, but the only big difference is it looks like Lawrence threw for all those yards on about 170 attempts more and a much lower completion percentage. So it looks like they had similar stats for fantasy, except Lawrence was a lot more erratic and inconsistent, like a lot more incompletions and a lot more interceptions. But other than that, the numbers were almost identical. I didn't notice that. Good call.
That's what I'm saying. So it's like people are acting like the sky is falling and Trevor Lawrence can never be good again. He could literally, if he has 25 touchdowns and 10 interceptions next year with 4,500 yards because he throws it 600 times a game.
2 less games for 2 less games played for Stroud.
Yeah. But like, this was a bad year for the argument, though, is that Stroud is coming off a fantastic year and everyone thinks he's amazing and the next big thing. And Trevor Lawrence, who had almost the same stats, but obviously was more erratic and had a bad year, is, washed now. So, again, that whole debate is just ridiculous. But it's like, okay, so Trevor Lawrence, let's just say, makes a minor improvement next year. Not huge, but a minor improvement next year. Has a better season. Calvin Ridley, you talked about the efficiency in the catch rate, 136 targets. That was great, but only 76 receptions. If he has 136 targets next year and 100 receptions, that's going to look a lot different too. And again, he had 1,000 yards. He had 8 touchdowns. Nico Collins also had 8 touchdowns. Like, what are we talking about? You mentioned the draft capital. So last year, it was insane. He was Nico Collins last year where the draft capital was so high. I was completely out. I did not draft Calvin Ridley on any of my teams. This year, you just said if he's wide receiver 40 or less, I'm hammering that all day, every day.
Want to know who goes in his range for receivers?
1,000 yards, 8 touchdowns. Like, who's he? Like, look at the people going next to him. I would much rather have Calvin Ridley and his potential upside.
He's got the receivers wise. He's got Jamison Williams, Xavier Worthy, Deontay Johnson, Keon Coleman, Ridley, Hollywood Brown, and Dotson. So he's going with largely the second or third tier of rookie receivers is what he's doing.
There is not a single wide receiver you just named that I would take above Calvin Ridley in any format next year.
No, I don't think
the fact that he's such a value. And again, I'm talking about incremental improvement after coming off his now first official full season back. If he can just, crack 100 receptions next year, he's easily going to have 12 to 1,300 yards and another 8 to 10 touchdowns, in my opinion.
Josh Downs is going 22 picks before him. Christian Watson is going almost 40 picks before him on Keep Trade Cut.
This is what I'm saying. Like, what are people? I honestly have I've been befuddled with some of the draft capital and like the picks that have been happening. Because again, I took time off. I'm not one of these ardent fantasy analysts that has to be the stat cruncher and stuff. Like I do comedy, bro. So it's like as soon as the season ended, I took probably a good month off easily, and then started kind of perusing some of the 2024 draft capital and some of the rankings and stuff that I've seen coming out already. I have to say I wildly disagree with a lot of it. I'm not going to be putting out rankings. Not really what I do, but man, I'll take advantage of it all day long. Cause like Calvin Ridley, like I said, Josh Downs versus Calvin Ridley is a hilarious debate in a vacuum, in a bubble. I think if you said that out loud to anybody, they'd be like, well, yeah, obviously Calvin Ridley. But then you look at the draft boards right now, and it's like there's something that happens psychologically. It's where people cannot ignore like the rankings on like the sites. So it's like people are smashing Josh Downs before Calvin Ridley. That's insane to me.
Yeah. I'm looking at, like I said, I can't believe the range he's in. Like last year, I was down on Calvin Ridley at wide receiver 14, but wide receiver 48, that's a whole nother range. So,
that's what I mean. It's like, last year he was Nico Collins, and that's why I'm so nervous about Nico Collins, because if Nico Collins does not ascend, and ascend meaning he's now going to have either 1,300 or more yards, and he's going to have more touchdowns in an offense that's predicated on wanting to run the ball and play defense. Like that's what the Texans want to do. So it doesn't match up in my mind that suddenly next season Nico Collins is going to explode for 1,500 yards and 10 touchdowns. And in the range that he's going, it's like you are almost expecting him to either at the bare minimum repeat what he just did or ascend even higher than what he's already done. And that's where I'm struggling to see that roadmap for him.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Stroud had 4,000 yards and 21 touchdowns or something like that. It's like CJ Stroud isn't going to throw 40 touchdowns next year.
Yeah, it feels like you're drafting, or Nico's being drafted at his ceiling and Calvin's at his floor. Like I worry it's a 29-year-old receiver, but at wide receiver 48, what's at 120 overall? So we're talking start of the 13th round, 12th round area. If he flops, it doesn't matter. It's a 12th round pick. You don't care.
This is basically the exact reverse of what we had last year. If we were having this conversation in 2023, Nico Collins would be in the 12th round and Calvin Ridley was in the second, third round. And I said last year, I'm not drafting Calvin Ridley at that price. That's insane to me. There's lots of other players in different positions. You can start looking at the onesie positions at that point, whether it's quarterback or tight end. There's lots of other running backs and wide receivers even that I would consider. Like, I don't see the path for Nico Collins, but he's the riser because last year he wasn't worth anything, and now suddenly he's a second, third rounder. Even in like the most savvy of formats, like you said, he's going third, fourth round, which is a huge increase from last year. And Calvin Ridley, who was going in that same range, has now dropped all the way to wide receiver 40 range, and he's basically free at this point. And again, it's like if he has a bad season, he's going to repeat with 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns at wide receiver 48. So he's going to return on value almost no matter what.
All right. Before we get out of here, you want to plug your stuff one more time? Tell us where we can find you.
Hell yeah. I mean, I got a lot going on, like I said at the top of the show. Every Monday morning at 8 a.m., we have the worst fantasy show dropping tomorrow, which is February 19th. I'll have John McGlynn on the show. He's been on Wildcard Wednesdays, so it's always a great time when he comes on. I have the Wildcard Wednesday series is still ongoing. We're at like episode 33 now or something like that, every Wednesday at 8 a.m. And of course, the new show that launched, the Worst Wrestling Podcast, you can find us Saturdays, 4:20 p.m. Eastern Standard, all of them.
When's John on your show, McGlynn?
John has been on a Wildcard Wednesday already, and he's going to be on tomorrow morning.
He's on mine Thursday.
Nice.
That's it. All right. This concludes the inaugural episode of the Mad Science Lab podcast, brought to you by both the Fantasy Football Advice Network and Fantasy Football Universe. Head over to fantasyfootballuniverse.com to check out our website, as well as the fantasyfootballadvicenetwork.com. to check out everything we have over there. I think a lot of our stuff is on both of them. We've got a little partnership here. The FFAN is sponsoring the 2024 Expo, so that should be interesting. But this concludes 2024 Dynasty Fantasy Football Riser and Faller, the first episode with Jack Lucenay. Thank you, Jack, for joining me today, kicking off the show, finding our way through the formula here. The first one's always the most fun. I feel like, we haven't gotten it down pat, and I kind of got to work out the kinks here, but did well. So thank you for joining me, Jack.
Hell yeah. I'll catch you guys on the flip side.
All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning into the Mad Science Lab podcast. Like I said, head over and check out FFAN and FFU. This has been the Mad Science Lab podcast. Take care and have a good night, everyone.